What's up, Tamers? Welcome back to the other decks. My name's Casual Dobo, and today I'm very excited to be presenting to you, honestly, my first attempt at a meta deck. As you've seen from other deck lists, I don't necessarily play the most traditional decks out there, I'd say. I think that's a fair estimate. But as I was going through BT5, Hexeblaumon was something that really excited me. Mostly because I think it builds off of a lot of what the blue starter deck was trying to do. And so to sort of incorporate some of that into this deck list, as well as some of the new tools that it has to play around with, overall, it's just a very exciting deck. And honestly, I'm just very excited to play blue in this format. However, it wouldn't be a deck on this YouTube channel if it was just kind of like a straight traditional meta, so I did make some sort of flavor adjustments, mostly inserting my favorite Digimon line, the Gomamon line, into here, and surprisingly, it all works out pretty well. So, without further ado, let's hop over to the deck list. Alright, so here we are at the deck list. Like I mentioned, I did add some sort of flavor additions into this deck. And we'll talk about it then, but there are some adjustments that you can make to make this sort of more competitive, more meta, however you want to call it. But either way, either of those decks start out with the Digitama, and so starting us off here, we do have 4 copies of Gomamon. So this is the one that says when attacking, if your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources on it, trigger draw 1. This is great because it plays a lot into our sort of strategy of stripping Digivolution sources off of our opponent's Digimon, and it kind of sets up a lot of the other plays that we have in terms of inheritables here. And plus, it's honestly one of the best blue Digi-Eggs that we have, probably until the next set or two. And then, as a 5th Digitama, we do have 1 copy of Gomamon. That says when attacking, trash the bottom Digivolution card of one of your opponent's level 4 or lower Digimon. Now this is a bit more situational, which is why it's the one of. And honestly, if you just kind of want to go more efficient, you can just have the 4 Gomamon and that's it. But once again, 1, trying to add some of that Gomamon line in here for flavor mostly. But 2, it does sort of lean itself into the strategy we're trying to go for, especially sort of early on. If that's like the first Digi-Egg you get, it's honestly not that bad. Now, going into our rookies, we do have 4 copies of On Play Gabumon. On Play, trigger draw 1. Honestly, is very good, especially if towards the middle to late game, you do need to hard play some rookies a little bit. This one honestly is a great choice for that, and the draw 1 is just overall very nice. Continuing on with the rookies, I do have 2 copies of Jamming Vmon. This is the Vmon that jams. Now, I was sort of playing around with the ratio of these, seeing if I wanted to go 4 copies of Vmon, but I decided not to. And in the comments, let me know if you think that is the right move or not. But I did replace essentially that with 4 copies of another rookie, which we'll talk about in a bit. Next up, we do have 4 copies of Gomamon. This is from BT5, part of the Hexeblaumon line, and it says, as an inheritable, your turn, once per turn, when you trash a Digivolution card, which hopefully we'll be doing a lot of, you gain 1 memory. This is nice, especially if you're sort of pairing it up with that Paildramon that we'll talk about in a bit. But overall, this makes it so that gaining memory is very easy to do. And there's a couple of different like techniques and cards that we have in here that will gain us a lot of memory, which is very nice. And then lastly, for the rookies, we do have 4 copies of Gomamon. Now, this is a vanilla card that came in with the starter deck, the blue starter deck, but it is a 2 cost to play rookie, which is kind of why I included it here. And this is the one where I was debating whether or not I go 2 of this one, 4 of Vmon, or do I go 2 Vmon and 4 of this one. And ultimately, I did go with this, mostly because the 2 cost to play is very memory efficient. And it's still weird for me to say memory efficient on one of my deck profiles because typically I don't care about memory. But we did want to build this, somewhat structurally sound, and so went with 4 copies of the 2 to play Gomamon. Next up, starting us off for our champions, we do have 1 copy of Lobomon. This is one that can digivolve onto a blue tamer as if the tamer was a level 3, so it's a hybrid. And honestly, just a nice little tech play in case it's needed towards the tail end. We can keep the Lobomon in our hand for when we want to do a sort of sneaky hit. Additionally, we can just play him like a normal champion and Digivolve him for 2. Next up, we do have 4 copies of that Paildramon that I mentioned. When Digivolving, you get to trash up to 2 Digivolution cards from the bottom of one of your opponent's Digimon, which is great, especially if your opponent has been building up something in the nursing area and has just pulled it out. This is a good way to, trash at least 2 of those, as well as trigger the inheritable off of Belugamon. As a reminder, you do need to have the Belugamon out on the field already and then Digivolve into it in order to have that combo go off. Next up on our champions list, we do have 4 copies of Gomamon. This is our 1 costed Digivolve blocker, and this is just, both memory efficient when it comes to setting up our plays, whether we leave the blocker out there or Digivolve up on top of it. But also 1 costed Digivolve blockers are just very nice to have in a deck, and honestly my preferred blocker to see. Next up on our champions list, we do have another card that comes from the starter deck, the blue starter deck, and this is 2 copies of level 4 Garurumon. Now this does have the inheritable of when attacking, trash a Digivolution card at the bottom of one of your opponent's Digimon. And you'll notice there's a lot of redundancy when it comes to effects in here, and that is intentional because I want to have that redundancy. For the most part, I do want to be stripping Digivolution cards off of my opponent's Digimon. And honestly, it doesn't feel that bad when, their entire board is cleared and you have to Digivolve into these. It just means you've done your job right. And then to round out our level 4s, another one from the starter deck, and this is 1 copy of Grizzlymon. This is the original OG blocker that is 2 cost to Digivolve, same effects as Gomamon, and 1 lasts to play. And I think, I was playing around with how many blockers I wanted in here. I originally did have 6, but took it down to 4, mostly because I wanted to be a little speedier when it came to getting to my Hexeblaumon, and having 6 blockers, especially that 6th one be that 2 cost Grizzlymon, just it felt a little bit slower than I wanted to. So I did reduce it to 1. I do think that it is important to have, just because I think 4 blockers in total doesn't feel that great. And so that's why I sort of included a 5th blocker. Mostly because as you're trying to set up that Hexeblaumon, especially if you don't draw into it, this deck kind of feels real slow, like it's not really working. And so having another blocker kind of gives us a little bit of more turns to stall, essentially. Moving on to our ultimates, we're going to start off with 2 copies of BT1 Zudomon. This is the one that on play you get to trigger draw 2. Now I originally did have the starter deck Zudomon, the one that when Digivolving trash 2 at the bottom of one of your opponent's Digimon. And once again, I was going for that redundancy, but as I was playtesting it, I found out I might have too much redundancy. So I included this here, especially if, for whatever reason, if you end up like with a hand of all ultimates, which I did during some of my test games, being able to sort of hard play for 7 this Zudomon and still get some benefit out of it, as opposed to the when Digivolving one, is very nice to have. And we only have 2 copies of it here, so we're not necessarily expecting it. Sort of just nice situational thing to have. It does also have a very nice ability of when attacking, if your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources, gain 1 memory. Next up, moving on to the ultimate that we're definitely hoping to have, we do have 4 copies of Chris Paildramon. This says when Digivolving, trash the bottom Digivolution card on all of your opponent's Digimon. Even though it's 1 and not 2, it's still nice that if they have something built up and many small things built up, they can sort of wipe all the Digivolution cards, or at least the bottom one, on all of those Digimon. And then it also has this incredible inheritable that says on your turn, if your opponent has no Digivolution sources, this Digimon gains security attack +1. And that kind of ability sort of meshes really well with Hexeblaumon as well as our secondary Mega. And then to round out the ultimates, we do have 3 copies of the starter deck 2, Garurumon. And now this doesn't necessarily have an active ability, but it does have the same inheritable as Chris Paildramon. And once again, going for that redundancy of abilities, and giving pretty much every chance we can to give one of our megas security attack +1. Moving on to our megas, the first one we're going to be talking about is Vikemon. This is a level 6, 4 cost to Digivolve, 12 to play. This says on your turn, when your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution cards underneath of it, this Digimon gains plus 1000 DP and security attack +1. So if you combine that with the ultimates we just saw, you ultimately get 3 total security attacks at 13,000 each hit, which honestly is pretty nice. Like I said, I love the Gomamon line, I love the Zudomon, Vikemon line, and so I wanted to include it in here just because, you know, it's both fun and on brand for what this deck is trying to do. However, I will concede this is not the best secondary mega to include into this deck. If I wanted to go and make sort of a more meta Hexeblaumon, I would actually include Ulforce Vidramon in here as a secondary, mostly because, and we'll talk about it a little bit, but when you're playing the Hexeblaumon deck as it sort of stands now, it is a bit slower. It requires, you know, your Hexeblaumon to be built up, and it's just in general a little bit more defensive, a little bit more stally. I believe that Ulforce is actually going to give you that aggression you need to sort of threaten your opponent's board a little bit. So even if you don't draw into your Hexeblaumon and you draw into an Ulforce, you can slap that on and then start doing some real damage onto your opponent's side of the field, especially if you combine that with the tamers that we have in this deck. It makes it real easy for Ulforce to kind of just go off for multiple hits at a time. Now you would need to change a couple of different cards to sort of match the Ulforce vibe, like Arrow Vidramon, but those are some sort of options to play with if you want to turn this deck into something a lot more either balanced or just a little bit more aggressive, to be honest. But I love Vikemon, so he's staying in my deck. Next up, moving on to the mega that is the centerpiece of this whole entire strategy, we do have 4 copies of Hexeblaumon. Now this says when attacking, you can trash up to 2 Digivolution cards at the bottom of one of your opponent's Digimon. Then, if your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution cards, which if you've played it right up to this point, there should be plenty, this Digimon gains jamming. And then also, and here's the big thing with Hexeblaumon, on all turns, your opponent's Digimon with no Digivolution cards can't attack or block. So ideally, you know, any of your blockers that your opponent has, they have no Digivolution cards, any strong attackers, especially if they've already gone up to the mega level, level 6 or level 7 before you, you can strip the Digivolution sources off them and install them out, and sort of give them a harder option because they can't Digivolve any higher from, you know, either those level 6s or level 7s, depending on what deck they're playing. So Hexeblaumon is just a very fantastic deck, mega. Is susceptible to obviously some hard removal, some options, but for the most part, this is going to do you very nicely for a very long time in the match. And then sort of to top off our Digimon, we do have 2 copies of the Blitz Omni. This is really good, especially if you have either that Vikemon or Hexeblaumon swinging into your opponent's security. You can swing in with Hexeblaumon, get that jamming, and then if you only need one more hit for the win, like you've cleared all security, Digivolve into this Omnimon. It has Blitz, so even if you pass 0, you're still going to be able to attack. And then when Digivolving, you get to unsuspend the Digimon. And then it does have a nice tertiary ability that says all turns, if an opponent's effect would delete this Digimon or return it to, you know, the hand or deck, you can prevent it from leaving by trashing a level 6 card underneath of it, which most case is either going to be that Vikemon or the Hexeblaumon. Now remember, you know, if you're doing it while your opponent still has some security, most likely you're going to still have some of these ultimates on it, and those security attacks will continue to affect that Omnimon. So do keep that in mind. Alright, so moving on to the option, and I would say that this is probably one of the spicier, more interesting selections, but I did go with 3 copies of Howling Crusher. Now this has a steep cost to play of 7, but the main ability of it is trash all Digivolution cards under all of your opponent's Digimon, and honestly, I'm sort of playing this so that hopefully, ideally, it's activated in security, because the security says activate this card's main effect. So say you have a Hexeblaumon on the field, and your opponent is essentially just trying to rush you. whether that's just swarming the board, etc., etc. They have a bunch of Digivolution sources, and you know, they're maybe swinging for lethal. If they swing in and hit this as one of the security cards, it trashes all of their things, and then suddenly their whole entire army is unable to attack because of Hexeblaumon's ability. Now I know that's sort of a lot to ask for, but really I'm not necessarily looking to see this in hand. This is kind of like a security play, to be honest, sort of, you know, my version of a trap card. When it hits, it's absolutely funny. When you find 3 of them in your hand, it's honestly not that great, but it is pretty situational. Like I said, it might be a little too redundant because we do have a lot of abilities that are stripping Digivolution cards as we're going into it. So this might be something that I'm looking to replace. So if you have any ideas as to what options I should be looking into, let me know in the comments below. We're still playing around with the options here. But something we're not playing around with is the 4 copies of Sora and Joe. This tamer is just incredible, especially for this deck. Honestly, I think there's a lot of other different decks that this can go into, but if you don't know, it is a 4 cost to play tamer. At the start of your turn, if your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources, which you should have, you gain 2 memory. And then on your turn, when you attack with a blue Digimon, you can suspend it to trash up to 2 more Digivolution cards from the bottom of one of your opponent's Digimon. When you have one of these on the field, it just makes everything about this deck just click more, and starts to become really oppressive when somehow you have 2 or 3 of these on the field. Like honestly, if your opponent gives you 3 memory and they have nothing on the field and you have 3 of these out, it's crazy jumping from 3 to 9 instantly. But yeah, this is just doing a lot of things that we wanted to do already, and this is also the reason why I say if you use all 4 Speedramon, this tamer works very nicely with it, because this suspends as you're attacking, which then triggers your O-Force to unsuspend. And then, you know, once you get into the era of Digimon, if it unsuspends during the main phase, it gains jamming, which is nuts. Sora and Joe, definitely among the all-stars of this deck. And there we have it. That's the deck list for Ice Palace Hexeblaumon. Like I said, there's a couple of additions in here that are more flavor-based, but you can definitely make a few minor tweaks here and there and make it a lot more, you know, competitive, a lot more viable. And overall, it's just a very interesting sort of control deck to have, especially for blue. And I love the fact that like it does sort of build off the original blue starter deck. So if you are getting into the game a little bit, you know, you've managed to find a couple of starter decks, one of them being blue, and you sort of want to do like a pretty good upgrade on it, I'd recommend Hexeblaumon. You don't necessarily need all of these cards. Like, you know, on play Gomamon is, you know, $5 each, right? For a while before I had this, I was running the starter deck Gomamon. And I will say BT5 stuff itself, the price is very good. So hopefully you won't have a hard time finding the Gomamon, the Paildramon, Chris Paildramon, and Hexeblaumon. That entire line, probably very key for this deck. But let me know what you think about the deck down below in the comments. And if you liked it, please give this video a like. I really appreciate it. And for more content like this, you know, Digimon decks, box openings, set talks, you know, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. That way you're notified whenever the next video comes out. But yeah, it's late over here. I need to get some sleep. I appreciate you watching, and until next time, catch y'all later.